Well, I want to welcome everybody for joining us tonight for this presentation. I'm quite excited to welcome Lori Kukler with us. Lori Kukler is our University Club archivist in resident. And she has been our archivist here at the club for, we were talking, I think, over 2.5 years. So quite a long period of time. However, she had a huge job when she accepted this role. We literally gave her a room on the 4th floor full of file cabinets, boxes, pictures, binders, books, stuff that we've been accumulating for 120 years at the club. And it was quite an undertaking. And I know you're still going through them. You're still uncovering items, timeline. So it's quite interesting what she pulls out of our history. So I did want to mention that throughout this presentation tonight, if you have a question, by all means, type your question in the question and answer box. You should see that on your screen. And she's going to do her best to answer questions throughout the presentation. And then she can also call for questions at the end. But don't hesitate, type in your questions throughout and she'll be happy to answer those for you. Again, welcome. And I want to thank Lori for taking time to do this. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Lori Kukler.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here tonight to do a presentation on what I will call the resilience of the University Club. Resilience is really called for right now. There's a lot happening in the world around us. And it gave me pause and it made me take a look at our records, and it gave me our current times offer me a lot of questions about what is it that people did during other times in our history where the environment, where the economy, where public health, wartime issues had an impact on the membership of the club. Because in all, the club is the membership. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to be presenting from a PowerPoint presentation. If you have any questions as I go ahead and put it into the question and answer box, and I'll take a look and see whether or not I can weave it in to the presentation. If it doesn't quite fit, I'll try to address it at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and we're going to get started on the, let's see, share screen. There we go. So are you seeing a PowerPoint presentation first slide? Can someone tell me? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and keep going as if you can see the screen that says the resilience of the University Club. The reason I call it the resilience of the University Club is that the first 50 years is because there's some particularly important things that happened during those first 50 years, and we only have an hour. So let's go ahead and, oh, you can see it. Thank you very much. The University Club has been through a tremendous amount of change, and it's been around for a very long time. There are very few organizations in the Portland area that have been around since before the turn of the century. We started out in 1897, generally meeting, and then they formed their charter in 1898 and did their articles of incorporation in 1901. So we've been around for a while. Okay, there we go. Times of challenge for the club are, I'm going to just highlight a few. There's more than one, but I'm going to highlight a few. the first challenge was maintaining the unique identity of the university club during its origins. And the next period of time was World War I, was a particularly important highlight. Prohibition was another challenge. And the Depression was, of course, a challenge. And then after the Depression was a really critical time in the club's history where it was necessary for us to decide how we were going to survive under trying economic circumstances. Our unique and early commitments and what makes us different is something that some of you have heard me talk about in previous situations. The University Club is different than the Arlington Club. It's different than Multnomah Athletic Club. It has a very unique perspective and calling. It is one where we have a very specific mission, so to speak. If we were a nonprofit, we would call it a mission. And in our articles of incorporation, the very first ones, our purpose is Article 2 actually, is the object of this incorporation shall be the intellectual and social welfare of college men in Portland and the vicinity. And you're wondering, why is that a challenge? If you think about it, there were very few individuals who were graduates of the major universities of our nation. The 55 charter members of University Club were from Yale. 10 of them were from Yale. 7 were from Amherst. 5 were from Harvard. 4 from University of Virginia. 4 from MIT, and the list goes on. A few from Princeton. And in a town, a small town, literally of 90,000 people, they had a difficult time finding the camaraderie that they felt during their university experiences. They had a difficult time locating intellectual conversations, and the brotherhood that came from their past university was something that they sorely missed. There weren't enough of any particular graduates in Portland because the city was so small. So they combined university graduates rather than having a Harvard club or a Yale club like the larger cities in the country did at that point in time. They became the University Club. It was a place where people could come together. And that particular, the reason I call this a time of challenge is that they were quite unique, and they wanted to get together, and they wanted to enjoy each other's company and read together, to review even the texts and the classics that they read during their undergraduate. And they wanted to continue to stimulate their minds in ways that necessarily at times our culture of Portland didn't offer them those opportunities. And their wives, of course, were a very important aspect of that, which is a whole nother presentation. So I would say that a period of challenge was the University Club needed to carve out its existence in a town that was not necessarily known for having college educated groups of people gathering. And so I would call that one of the first challenges in their establishment. And then, of course, they built the club, and we've had presentations on building the club, but I would like to step past that and move on to World War I, which began, within 20 years of when the club was formed, and a few years after we made major investments in the building that we now use as our clubhouse. And so at the point in time when our membership, who were relatively young at that point in time, they were in their 20s and 30s, and a few were in their 40s at this point, when they were finally getting the club established, unfortunately, we began to participate in World War I. World War I was a very significant time of challenge for the club. And in the years 1917 and 18, we had 109 members serving in active duty. 2 members were killed while performing their duties, Earl Cobb and Ralph Holbert. And the war had a devastating impact upon our total membership. So I wanted to take a moment here and show you some of the primary documents that I've been digging into. Right now, this is a page within one of our records, and it's the University Club Roll of Honor in special remembrance of those who laid down their lives in devotion to the great cause and in honor of all who joined the colors. The names here are recorded of men who responded to the call and entered the active service of their country from the membership of the University Club during the World War. So of course, these 2 gentlemen passed away. One passed away in training school, and my understanding is it might have been the influenza epidemic that took him as well as many, many soldiers. And then Ralph was killed in the Argonne Forest. I want to go ahead and mention Earl Samuel Cobb because if he did in fact pass away from influenza, that brings us to the topic of what is it that in what way was the club challenged by the epidemic of 1917 through, actually it continued on through 1922? In what way were we impacted? Quite frankly, during that period of time, the membership was not impacted as much by the influenza epidemic as it was by the war itself. Do keep in mind, though, that the population bell curve of that pandemic was ages 18 through 25. That's who that particular virus hit hard, in the same way that it hits elderly and people who have existing conditions now. So that bell curve of the most vulnerable was people in their 20s, early 20s. And so it's difficult to know. We didn't have a lot of members that age during that period. So I didn't see a lot of indication that we had casualties from the any other situation other than the war itself. So this is a fascinating and touching series of slides that show you all of the individuals who served in World War I. So keeping in mind, we had over 100 members serving, and our membership was barely, at this point in time, was barely 300 people. So that is a lot of members not here. And the ramifications for the club was significant because we were sending our medical, notice there's medical corps here. One of the largest groups is the medical corps. And that's because we had so many doctors as members in the club. And we had a few people serving in the Navy, and we had a couple gentlemen who served in the British Army. One of them is Andrew A. Hall, and it is Dr. Andrew A. Hall. And I wanted to drill into his story because it is highly representative of what is important to the club. Andrew Hall wrote letters back home, and he reflected to a couple individuals. We are not sure who this is. We think it might be Jan. This is a letter from the Oregon Historical Society. And I wanted to take a second and read to you one of the other letters. This is the first page of one of his letters. But one of the other letters that he wrote is so touching and so representative of the resilience of the club, representative of the sacrifice of the kinds of individuals who participated in us, in our membership. This is from Dr. Hall. War is simply scientific butchery and murder on a wholesale scale. This must be the last war, and it is up to every individual everywhere to see that it is the last war. There's something extenuating in a fair hand-to-hand fight, but what can one say for great shells fired from 8 to 10 miles away at human beings? I had all kinds of narrow escapes, and indeed owe my life to the mud which I have hitherto cursed out loud and long. Several times shell burst within 10 or 15 feet, but they buried themselves a little before they burst, with the result that all I received was a shower of mud and water. Some of these lumps and mud stung so much that it took a second or two to realize fully that it was mud that hit me and not steel. In ordinary hard ground, you, old friend, would have been kaputted a dozen times over. And this is what's significant to hear from Dr. Hall. All war is horrible, but it is good to remember it's only a passing phase. The world will go on. People will forget the horrors and desolation, and only the pleasant things will be remembered. The barbarians can destroy Belgium, lay waste to France, or violate every instinct of decency and order. But poetry and art and education and beauty will live and flourish in spite of all their efforts. I think Dr. Hall is an excellent example of the kind of person and the kind of tenacity that was represented in the membership of the University Club during the war and the pandemic of 1917, 18, 19, and 20. He offered that layer that the University Club has that, I'll be egotistical, other clubs don't have, where we value art and beauty and literature and the liberal arts and thinking. And that has been the common thread throughout the University Club's history. The war ended in November of 1918, but had no immediate positive impact upon the financial health of the still struggling University Club. The club operated at a loss for the years of 1917 and 19, with 1918 being the worst at a negative 5,728. For us, that might not seem like a lot, but in that economy, that was a great deal. Finally, later in the 1919 fiscal year, the board had to request, imagine this, had to request 25 members to guarantee a $5,000 loan to meet expenses. So the loss of membership and dues, and particularly the loss of the higher income members who were in the medical corps, had a devastating effect upon the budget of the University Club after the war and in the early 20s. And then we ended up with prohibition. That's Police Chief Ralph Jenkins there, and he's demonstrating busting a site that had some location, not the University Club, don't worry, that had alcohol during what we now understand to be an economic disaster, and which was prohibition. The club really struggled during that period of time. But in fact, the club did continue, that there's a statute of limitations is over, so I can say the club did continue to serve alcohol during prohibition, but they had some very strict rules because they did not want the liquor authority to come through. So here were their rules. No employee of the club shall, under any circumstances, be allowed to serve liquor in the club. Notice it says employee. 2, no liquor shall be allowed to be served either in the main dining room or in the ladies' dining room. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot of rooms at the University Club. So they're just saying not those rooms. Now, keep in mind, part of the reason they were keeping that away from the ladies is because a good number of our ladies auxiliary people were temperance pledgers, and so they were not receptive to alcohol, so they needed to also keep alcohol away from many of the ladies. No one dealing in liquor shall be allowed to enter the club for the purpose of delivering orders of liquor. So liquor dealers could come in the club, but they couldn't come there for the purpose of delivering orders. So basically what this looked like was members, private citizens would come to events at the club and bring their liquor with them. And so there was no vendor per se for the liquor officially, but it's difficult to know what really is going on. But during the 20s, things started to improve for the club. So it appears that there was probably a thriving event and party venue during Prohibition at the club. And I can only speculate, but they never seemed to have any problems with City Hall. So I'll leave that to your imagination because I don't want to assume more than I should, but I think it would be, with so many members who actually worked at City Hall, it's a bit of a curiosity that nothing ever happened with the Liquor Authority. So let me give you an example here, some numbers. Notice here there's membership, entrance fees, dues, assessments. This is from the comparative statement of income, 24 through 27. Notice it says soft drinks, cards, etc. So soft drinks means they were not selling alcohol. There was no bar. As far as the income and expense information is concerned, there's no indication of any kind of alcohol sales during the entire period of Prohibition. And so you'll see there that we were moving along and our basic operating income was going up steadily during the 20s. And so probably we were a bit of a party place in Portland. But there were some very strict behavioral rules, and I've seen in the minutes of the board of directors, on several occasions they are removing members for their behavior during a gathering at the club. They did not want, they wanted to stay under the radar. So if someone was openly intoxicated, they were removed from the membership. Now, this is an interesting thing. 1933 Prohibition ended, so they survived that period. It was not easy, but they survived that period because alcohol sales was a big part of the club's income. Now, notice the difference between 1932 and 1933. 1932, bar, of course, cards, etc. They have reclassified that line or redefined that line. Notice how it jumps from 1,700 up to 10,034 and 9,035. So here we are, post-Prohibition, moving along, and the club has managed to survive to some extent, and in large part because the income generated from alcohol sales went up so dramatically. So in the 1930s, now we're of course, the 1929 is the beginning of the Depression, which doesn't really take full effect for a couple of years because that's, you know, big ships turn slow. But the descending economy had a probably our most serious challenge for the club was the Depression decade. Income generating activities of the club began to slowly unravel because yes, people were able to sell alcohol, but after the beginning of the Depression, over time, people had less and less money. Membership declined, and it also required heartbreaking reduction in the staff. Many of the staff lived at the club, so it was like a family, and it was rough. The club can only continue to exist as if it engaged in what the board called a rigid economy. In other words, they started cutting everything they could think of in order to survive because of the declining membership. And also they had assets and they were not receiving any income from those assets because people couldn't afford to pay rent. Prohibition Act repealed, but the annual deficit by the time that was repealed in 1933 was $14,000. $14,000 in 1933 is a tremendous amount of money. So President Platt in 1934 made a very, very touching presentation in the annual meeting. And here's his report to the membership. He says, there are those on the council as well as in the membership who regard the financial future of the club as more or less hopeless due to the long continuance of the depression, the loss of approximately 1/3 of the regular active membership, and the increased costs of services set forth in more or less detail earlier in this report. It's clear to those of us who take a courageous view of the club's future that while the coming year is going to be exceedingly trying from the standpoint of income and outgo to preserve our commercial credit and keep up our current obligation on the first mortgage and for taxes, and to make some reasonable showing upon our local bank debt, but the fullest cooperation on the part of the membership in keeping their current accounts promptly paid, the situation is by no means hopeless. We are operating a business doing well above the $100,000 a year force on the payroll, and a force on the payroll is still 31. To operate this business effectively, economically, and profitably in these times is no mean business performance, and that the club has been able to continue without embarrassment is a tribute to the fidelity of the ongoing council and those who have preceded it since the depression came upon us. So these are very trying times, and that president had some very encouraging words for the membership. But unfortunately, there was a recession. Those of you who are economists would know that there was a recession at the very end of the depression that was a particularly brutal final blow to a good number of organizations. So the University Club took on a federal plan for reorganization of the UC finances, or Chapter 11. As the wartime economy began to improve, unfortunately, it was too late for the University Club at that time. So keep in mind, many of you know that Portland was a thriving economy in World War II, but the perfect storm was that it was too late before we had to file. So in 1939, we filed for financial reorganization through the US District Court. Plan was approved in 1940, and by 43, the club was again solvent. And that is due in large part because it was a good plan, but also the economy in the area was thriving, and membership increased dramatically because we had, think of the Kaiser shipyard, think of the industry of the war complex. So the wartime club suddenly began to thrive within the growing economy, and by 1944, only 5 of the 450 memberships were available to prospective members or candidates. And so the club itself ended up doing a very good job working with the federal government and the US District Court to put together a plan that worked. And also the plan worked because members began to join us. And so with that in mind, during a period of strength, when we had more people wanting to be members than we had room for, in 1944, a time of deep fiscal strength, the entire membership authorized a special committee to revise the bylaws. Several amendments were added that would assure the financial solvency of the club into the future. And so the club made it through its original period of the founders just having good financial scrutiny and managing things as best they could under extremely trying circumstances. But eventually in 1944, the membership decided that what needed to happen was we needed to have amendments built into our bylaws that made it so that we must remain solvent. And so it's actually a fascinating work, and it does an excellent job of protecting us from economic downturns. And so, you know, as we move forward now, you can see why the way that the leadership of the University Club inspired this presentation, because once again, the club is taking on an extraordinary amount of resiliency, and it is offering very creative solutions to something that the club actually has never had to face before, which is we had to shut our doors for a period of time. And so this is something we've never had to face before. And we can thank our current administration, as well as the administrations of the past, for creating a system and a situation and bylaws that will continue to protect the club for people in the future when this too passes, as was said by Dr. Hall. So that's what I have for you today. If you have any questions for me, I would be more than happy to respond to those. Let's see. So I have a question I'm reading right now. Okay, so here's a great question. This is, it says here, so here, the past experiences were shared struggles. We're in that era now, but so isolated. That's a good point. We cannot meet. What does history tell you about ways in which we do not lose the common mission at the UC as we are working remotely and not even coming into the building? That's an excellent question. Now, this is just me reflecting right now. And I would say that the members that were serving in World War I generated a tremendous, and World War II, as a matter of fact, generated a tremendous amount of correspondence. Several boxes in the archive are letters from members writing to the club. And some of the letters written by Dr. Hall indicate that he was writing to other service members throughout the Corps and throughout both the British Army and the American Army and Navy. And so I think the way that we can stay connected would be, I think what these people are teaching us is that we have to take it upon ourselves to remain connected. I think it's nice that we have some miracles of electronics available to us, and we can learn about all of the goings on at the club. And there are individuals giving presentations, doing interviews. And so I think the answer right now is we have something that these folks didn't have, which is we have virtual experiences like what we're doing right now. It's time for introspection. So perhaps having me do more historical pieces so that we can take this time to reflect upon the importance of the club throughout time. And then as we move forward into the future, we do so knowing ourselves a little bit better. Let's see what we've got here. What was the nature and impact on programs or activities of the club? Was it strictly eating and drinking? That's a great question as well. Interestingly enough, the ladies auxiliary, the very first iteration of women participating in the club, had a very, very busy agenda of guest speakers and performers throughout the first 2 decades of the club. If you go into the minutes, they're approving this person or that. The women, of course, had to have someone on the board approve any of their speakers, and some of them were, there was a few Marxists in there, and the board said, no, which is, you know, that was their prerogative to do that. And it gives you a little bit of a window into what the women's auxiliary was comprised of. So I would say that outside of, there was always food involved. There was always beverages involved of one kind or another, but there were dances, there were holiday gatherings, there were lectures, there were musical performances. All of those things continued on throughout the history of the club. Hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, go ahead and ask a little more. Were local politicians in Portland among the University Club memberships during those early years? Yes, they were. Most of the members were more involved in institutions of one kind or another, weren't necessarily politicians. Different hospitals, the World's Fair, and different hotels. A good number of our members were primarily architects and doctors and professionals along those lines, more so than politicians. We had the occasional politician, but by and large, most of those folks went to Arlington Club. We had a different focus at the University Club. Yes, yes, thank you. Someone mentions that the portrait of Dr. Hall in the boardroom, painted by the premier portrait painter in Portland at that time, Sidney Bell. Dr. Hall was also the general manager of the club. Dr. Hall was a beloved person. In fact, I'm thinking that my next profile of a member, early member, is probably going to be Dr. Hall. He was an extraordinary man. And he lived actually on site at the club for a period of time. Did we own the building throughout? Not entirely, not entirely. At first, there was a lot of fancy footwork, but we had individuals who wanted this building in place, who were very generous in their original donations. So I'm trying to think of the records. I'd need to take a look at that. I think a good history of the finances of how these folks put this place together in 1911 and 12 is basically financial magic, is what one founder said. And it is highly complicated, and I haven't quite figured out how they did it. I've got deeds from the Corbett properties, I've got things that I'm going through, and I still haven't quite cobbled together. I might call in an economic or a budget specialist to help me try to figure out what in the world they did. Here's someone making a comment. Says here, someone says, in this time where everything is instant, always looking for the next big thing, the future, how do we make our past relevant to members? I'm reading a book now on the years leading up to World War II in Britain, and I'm struck by how history does repeat itself. It sure seems to, doesn't it? Lessons we can learn now, but that history is so often reduced to names and dates and never stories. Your talk tonight reminds me that history is about people. I thank you for that. I'll take that as a compliment. History for me is only about people. History wouldn't happen if it weren't, well, people's history, that is, wouldn't happen without them. So yeah, thank you for that nice comment. How did the club manage the Prohibition period? Oh man, it was a tight walk. A tightrope. They were constantly thumping membership because the parties were getting out of hand, and they were just very concerned that the liquor authority was going to come through. They would send out letters. One of the letters is in the UC Club history that was written a few years ago, and it's a chilling letter, and it basically is telling people, if you don't behave during these gatherings, we're going to remove you as a member. Because we can't afford to have the liquor authority shut us down, and which is what they would do. What were the best years in the last century in terms of membership and revenue? To what do you attribute that? I would say the best would be the war years, the 1940s. And now a lot of the membership during the 40s, when people were in active duty, the club did not charge them dues. And so there were people who were very, very grateful for that. And so they were constantly writing, and there was in the men's meeting area, there were a lot of letters that came into the bar all the time from people serving in active duty all over the world. And so that period of time probably was, and the local members who were of means and could afford to pay dues and did. And we maxed out our membership all the time, and there was a waiting list during a period of time during the war. Here's a great comment. It seems to me that it's now is an opportune time to examine the club's relationship to the community. We certainly have strong connections to our arts and education members, but I wonder if there are more ways we could educate ourselves about how our broader community is coping with this pandemic, and perhaps partner with BIPOC organization to support some of those who are struggling. Have you seen evidence of the UC doing community work of that type at any point in history? Absolutely. The University Club, primarily led by the Women's Auxiliary, was extremely active during the influenza pandemic of 1917 through 22, and during World War II. They would have, where we have the lunchroom right now, would be the room where they would put together packages for soldiers with boots and blankets and socks and undergarments and the basic necessities that the war effort was simply not providing to our servicemen and women overseas, because the war was run on a shoestring. And so the women who heard back from those overseas were outraged at the lack of supplies that the soldiers were getting. So they started putting together their own packages and sending them off to make sure that the members or other members in the community got what they needed. As well, and this is primarily spearheaded by the Women's Auxiliary, which was happily allowed by the men of the club, because the concern for fellow man is a very, very much an aspect of the University Club. And so offering lectures and enlightening activities to both members and the community was a big part of the Women's Auxiliary, particularly in the first 30 years of the club. Yes, our building is on the Oregon Registry of Historic Landmarks, and we offer tours for that when we aren't experiencing a pandemic. Can the club's YouTube videos, President's Report, which we call, can be put in the UC archives somehow? I think that's a great idea. Archiving is not just a paper thing anymore, it's an electronic thing. So to begin creating a digital archive is the next step for our archive. Absolutely, that is true. Okay. How did the club board members progress toward admitting women as full members? Was it a long process, short? What debates happened? That is a question I've been working on since I started. There were women members. They were called women members. They weren't members, they were women members. from the beginning. They were the women's auxiliary members, and there was a limit of 25. They weren't allowed to have any more than 25. That later changed when the women's extension of the club became so significant, so much a part of the community, so much an aspect of Portland's cultural life and intellectual life, as a matter of fact. And so the definition of women's participation in the club changes. And it wasn't until the 80s that women were allowed to be a member. And even then, it's difficult to nail down. I don't have a good answer to that question because the records I have are not complete, but I do have lots of stuff in the board minutes of, for example, women were first admitted as spouses to members. Then when the first male member passed away and his wife became a widow, the club had to decide, oh, what do we do now? Do we tell her she can't come anymore? Well, they immediately decided that she could remain an auxiliary member. And then, does that mean her daughter comes as well? And so there's this ongoing modification of how the history of women in the club that I still haven't nailed down the dates to my satisfaction yet. Now women can function fully, and there's no limits based on gender or sexual orientation whatsoever. That's where we are now. But it's a journey. It was a long journey. And I'm hoping to have better answers for that in the future. I do not officially know when the first Black member was admitted to the university and who they were. That the answer for women in the club is basically the same. The same as with women. This is an area that I want to, the reason I can't guess or assume is because I have to see all the records before I can decide what a first is. And so I do know that we have a lot of people in the club throughout the 20th century from the Pacific Rim. A lot of business people in town were admitted to the university club. People of color were admitted to the university club, from what I can tell, but I have to do more research, long before Arlington Club or other places. But I don't have a full, I can't answer that question completely right now, but it is an extremely important one that I do hope to have a good answer for. Any more questions?
Well, if there's not any more questions, I want to pop on here and say how wonderful this presentation was, Lori. I learned so much, and it just actually, there was periods of time where it just made me proud to be a member of the university club. Not like I'm not already proud, but just that I am part of history. And so I really appreciate that. And I don't know about anybody else, and we can talk about this on the side, but I'd love for maybe another one of these in the future when you're able to find some more information. And I think that it just tells us that we are heading in the right direction. Challenges will come our way, and we will be better for them in the future.
Yeah, well, thank you for letting me, thank you for joining me in my studio. This is my husband and I, this is our room. And so I thought about doing the Christmas tree thing, but my computer isn't by the tree. And my husband's an artist, and a printer and a photographer, and I'm a musician and historian. So this is our creative space. And so I'm really glad you folks could spend some time with me in my creative space.
Well, we thank you very much, and I appreciate all the people participating today. We had a great attendance.
We did.
Thank you. And Lori, let's do this again at some point.
Okay,
all right.
let's do it.
Thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you soon.